It's really easy to create a new best practice. You click on the Create New Best Practice button in the software, you enter in your best practice content in the fields, you attach the evidence that proves your points, and since you associate your best practice with specific media, whenever that media is recommended in the media plan, your best practice is mapped to that stage in the milestone where it's going to be most relevant to the individual person in your organization. That best practice will be available in the Marketing Evolution database of best practices, but it will also be automatically pushed to the right person at the right time via email. This best practice training is about how do you go about writing the content that is going to be useful and powerful for that end user at that moment when they most need it. Make it compelling and keep it simple. Think checklists. This tells the marketer and the professional in advertising what to do during the campaign milestones. Be concise. Include a few succinct directives. Remember, recipients are busy and have only a minute to read the best practices that arrive in their inbox. Create 3 checkpoints in each best practice and no more than 7. Create a best practice, not a mediocre practice. Aim high. Consider whether it's a useful insight or whether the reader will see it as, I don't know about that. Give advice that's important to campaign success, not just an interesting idea. Provide actionable directives. Remember, if it's not prescriptive, it's not a best practice. Don't write best practices that are redundant to our impact-based planner. Marketing Evolution's planning software already recommends media budget allocations to achieve objectives. So telling people to spend on television or digital or social media, that's not a best practice. That's something that comes out of the optimization plan. Instead, a best practicer tells people how to execute the creative in television or on the internet or in social media. Help them use those elements of the marketing mix to work in synergy and to be more effective in general. In your best practices, try to show contrast. Try to show an example of something that worked really well, contrasted with someone who didn't follow that best practice that got very poor results. That's where some of the best learning occurs. Write prescriptive headlines. Use a verb. Let me give you an example. Feature TV celebrities in television ads. That's a good headline. Utilize TV celebrity in TV ads. That's weak. The second thing to really pay attention to when you're filling out and creating a best practice is the way in which you tick the boxes around who the right participants are to match your best practice. So really think about who would be the end user of this best practice, who'd be applying it. You can assign the best practice to a milestone, which is when would that person most likely need this best practice in that timeline of getting that campaign done. You can assign it to more than one, but we really encourage you to try to find just one and maybe at max 2 milestones that the best practice applies to. Relate the best practice to the relevant media channels. In the example above, feature TV celebrities in television ads, that would of course apply to all television ads, but it might also apply to digital video. It might also apply to other forms of advertising. Maybe this recommendation also is relevant to magazine advertising as well, or out-of-home advertising. So tick the boxes for as many of the media in which you believe this best practice would be relevant and helpful to the end user. Use the check marks in the content area to really focus on those 3 to 7 important takeaways. And summarize your content in a couple of sentences in the abstract. Back up your best practice with solid evidence. Select evidence from reliable sources. It can include articles, white papers, academic papers, webinars, expert opinions. Ideally, it's going to be data-driven empirical research that drives your best practice. In fact, you'll see a scale below that we use to score all the evidence in there so you know the quality of research that's going into generating this best practice. Now, if you happen to be using a PowerPoint deck that has some great research in it, you don't need to include the whole deck. In fact, we encourage you to pick the 5 slides or 1 slide that really supports your point, that demonstrates the data and the research proof. And that's all you need, and just upload that. Now, let me show you a few real-world examples of good, well-written best practices and ones that maybe aren't quite as strong. So this one's great. I mean, look at this headline. It's imperative, it's fun, it's clear. You got a mix of roles that have been selected when they're creating this best practice for whom the point of get moving with ad imagery, movement grabs attention would be relevant. You can see one milestone where this is most useful, which is during the creative development process. You can see that it applies to television as well as online video. They've picked a few different channels for which this point's relevant. A concise summary abstract and only 4 checklists. So they've stayed within that 3 to 7 checkpoint rules. This is a fast and efficient best practice that can be really useful to someone who's just about to go into creative development and is using video in some fashion. Now let me show you an example of a best practice that's missed the mark for contrast. Wow, thematic breakthroughs across campaigns. That's not really imperative. It's not giving a directive to really do anything. So that's pretty weak. You've got way too many milestones. This same best practice would show up in 5 different points. And really, it ought to show up in 1, maybe 2 at most. And wow, look at all this content here. I mean, this isn't concise and it's not down to checklists. So way too much. This probably should be in a PDF with the summary of these points turned into a best practice checklist. Key points again, take the reins and tell the reader what to do. Use the imperative tense. The unstated subject of each of these best practices, you, as in you, marketer, do this. Think in exclamation points. Don't actually use them in the content, but that should be the expression that's coming across in your best practices. And really, you only need the non-imperative points in your bullet points or your subpoints that are supporting your key to-do items. Quick style guide, when to use punctuation, don't need it in headlines. Use uppercase in the headlines, and be conversational in your tone, and try to avoid using buzzwords. Also, try to avoid asking questions. You want to be giving people actionable, imperative statements of what they ought to be doing based upon best practice research. Key takeaways from this training: make it compelling, keep it simple. Take the reins and tell the readers what to do, and back up your best practices with solid evidence.